Welcome back to UMFST Live, Myths and Realities about the European Union. We are addressing in each interview a topic which is very important on how this information works and what is happening in the online media. We are every day we are facing disinformation. Every day we are finding fake news. Every day we can find messages on these social media platforms that are telling us certain things. There are many of them disinformation, or at least they are generating populism, and they want to do that. Our last interview with the Republic of Moldova, it was really attacked in the online platforms. The troll factories took our post and started to address and popularize their ideas about the Republic of Moldova and how everything has to change there, and the fact that Russia must decide when it comes to the Republic of Moldova, and not the people, the Moldovians, who have to decide what their country will look like and how they can address their problems, the problems they are facing now. Populism is on the rise, and the troll factories that we addressed several shows ago with Mr. General Crăciun are taking the internet to promote certain ideas. So you have to be really careful, because many times the posts you are seeing, the comments you are seeing, and the information which is posted is not a quality information, and it's used to give you the idea or give you a certain perception over the things that are unfolding. Nowadays, the situation in the East is really complicated. We have seen the B9 format. We have seen the visit of Joe Biden in Eastern Europe, the commitment he has for the Eastern flank, and we have also seen the Putin declarations. All these are targeted, of course, in the online media also. So today I want to talk about a different thing. Starting from our last interview on the Republic of Moldova, I think there is one subject that must be addressed: populism. Because it's not only relating to disinformation, but it's also related on how the society reacts to certain information and how they are dealing and analyzing it. So populism here is really important. We have seen a rise in populism at the European level, and we have to discuss about populism in a very responsible manner. This is why I invited an expert on this area and this subject. Giuseppe Martinico is a full professor of comparative public law at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa. He previously had the pleasure to receive several grants from Garcia Pelayo Fellow at Center of Political and Constitutional Studies in Madrid and Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. What we have in common is that we both had Jean Monnet projects, and we developed and implemented such projects. Mine is in European security and disinformation, and his project was on European public law use. He wrote a book on filtering populist claims to fight populism, The Italian Case in a Comparative Perspective. It was published at Cambridge University Press. So thank you so much, Professor, for accepting our invitation, and thank you for taking your time to talk on this subject, which is really important at the European security, which is populism.
Thanks indeed for having me. It's a great honor. It means a lot to me. Thanks so much.
I will start with a quote from your book, which I think is really important on how populism is unfolding at the European level. And you said like this: in 2018, Italy witnessed the formation of a populist government, which was the result of two different populist forces: Liga, previously called Liga Nord, Northern League, and Movimento 5 Stelle, with very different agendas and voting constituencies, forming a coalition. So we can see that populist parties who address different audiences can unite forces, and we see this in Romania also. What generates and entertains the populist agenda and populist audiences, and how are these different audiences, left, right, connected?
Well, thanks indeed for this question. Populists indeed are very good at mobilizing people. So as if They were in a sort of permanent electoral campaign, and they do that by focusing on the moral arguments in a very divisive manner in order to construct the enemy. They need the enemy in order to reinforce themselves. So they also rely in this sense on the opposition between the real people and the enemies of the people. And in my book, I try to focus on three aspects that, in my view, tend to galvanize their approach, and so tend to explain how they can mobilize and entertain people. And these three aspects are extreme majoritarianism, which means that they tend to reduce democracy to the rule of majority. Second element is identity politics. And the third element is the so-called politics of immediacy. So they don't like, all those actors standing between the leader and the people, so parliaments, the political parties. So in this sense, if you take the first element, extreme majoritarianism, this means that populists frequently understand constitutions as straitjackets, and in the sense that they perceive constitutions and constitutionalism as obstacles to the fulfillment of the real democracy, the will of the people. So they create another false dichotomy. They are very good at creating false dichotomies that between constitutionalism and democracy reduce it to the rule of majority. Concerning the second element, identity politics, scholars have explained quite well that populist leaders, let's say, claim to determine the purposefully, constitutionally inclusive notion of the people by depicting the popular entity as a unitary, identitarian and exclusionary concept. Here I can give you some examples. In order that you see how populists have abused constitutions in order to codify the image of the enemy. For instance, in the Hungarian Basic Law, in its article R.4, they wrote that the protection of the constitutional identity and the Christian culture of Hungary shall be an obligation of every organ of the state. Another example is the Russian Constitution, Article 67, stating that the Russian Federation provides the protection of the historical truth. So they use the moral argument, the argument of the values, the historical argument, the religious argument to create the enemy and to depict the European Union as a target in this sense. The European Union is seen by right-wing populists, is depicted by right-wing populists as a sort of threat to the traditional values. Think of how Orban describes the European Union. While the European Union is seen by left-wing, let's say, populists as a threat to the social justice, to the welfare state. So it is depicted as it were a mere neoliberalist or neoliberal entity, while it is much more. Finally, immediacy. So immediacy means that populists attack parliament, seen as the venue of corruption, and they frequently also attack the political parties, and evidence of this is, for instance, the recent constitutional reform passed in Italy, which reduced the number of the members of the parliament. The parliament was seen by the Five-Star Movement as the source of all the problems. So, this is very telling of how they capture, we'll say, their their audience. So thanks so much for this question.
Yes, and it's very interesting to what you mentioned, because populists need an enemy, and it's always us versus them. You need this separation. You need an enemy, which in the pandemic time it was like vaccinated, non-vaccinating. You believe in the pandemic, you don't pandemic effects or not. It was like us, them, and it always something radical between in what is happening there, and they need that. They need that foreign madness, or it's another type of rhetoric. It's the foreigners who are attacking us, and we had that migration period in which, if we recall, populism was on the rise on the idea that migrants, them, are menacing our security, us. Is the same thing that is happening at the European level. The European Union, them, it's menacing us, our lifestyle, our values, our history, our identity, and it's the same thing we find, for example, in the last Putin discourse. It's them, the West, it's actually aggressing us, and we have to defend ourselves. So it is a rhetoric built on this, which generates movement and social movements, and certain types, those movements are quite radical, and they are going through revolutionary ideas. So we have to change the state, we have to change the institution. Nothing is representative, nothing is good enough. So we have to change everything. How? Not exactly, they are not exactly telling that, but it's only generated this kind of emotion, because populism needs emotions. And this is where I want to go to with the next questions. Because if we look in history, if we look of what happened in the past and now, we can see that there are moments in history when populism is on the rise. And we have moments where populism is better manifested in at social level, and it's less. Why are we witnessing this periodical return of populist movements? Why we see it now?
Thank you. Well, it's very difficult to find universal answers, of course. It depends very much on the context we are taking into account. I teach the comparative law, so I always try to, contextualize the thing. Indeed, some scholars have attributed the success of populism to the economic crisis and to the way in which the EU responded to the economic crisis so far. So the boomerang of the austerity approach. Others instead, have attributed the success of populism to the decadence in the way of politics of the traditional parties. Other scholars have identified the source of their success in the corruption of the institutions. However, I think that as Pippa Norris wrote it in her book, it would be a mistake to attribute the rise of populism only to economic inequality, as there are important psychological factors that should be taken into account, and they have played a major role. Think of what happened in the United Kingdom, with the so-called Brexit. So what lawyers, because I'm a constitutional law scholar, what the lawyers can do in this respect is try to prevent the return of populism by working on the constitutional design. So by creating a series of antidotes, that in theory could work right in the long run. For instance, an example like the Hungarian system is very interesting from this point of view. There I think that populists were facilitated by the absence, for instance, of a bicameral system. So you you, I mean, lack something in terms of checks and balances. They don't have then an eternity clause, which means that all the constitution can be amended. And this, of course, is very dangerous, because this means that contingent majorities can decide over fundamental rights that should belong to all the members of the people, right? So to all the people of the indeed. I mean, while they tend to attribute, I mean, rights only to those that can be traced back to the real people, so to those who follow, I mean, the leader. So as you can see, there are things that can be done in order to minimize at least, I mean, the risk of a populist return. Although, of course, I mean, we lawyers don't have the crystal ball, but this can help, I mean, I'm sure. Thank you.
Well, actually, I don't think that anybody has this crystal ball, and I'm telling that because you mentioned the case of Hungary. Well, as you know, in Transylvania we have Hungarian population here, and the Orban propaganda, for example, in Hungary was felt here in Transylvania also, and we had a very interesting case in Detroit several years ago where the population revolted, and when I say revolted, it was quite medieval, against two foreigners that came from Sri Lanka, saying that they are menacing their way of life and their values, and it was quite rooted in the urban rhetoric. So this is why it's important to talk about populism and to see how its means of propagated itself in different communities, and also which are the legal instruments we can use when it comes to combating populism. And here I'm so glad you mentioned the constitutional level, but I will go to the next level, the European level, because it's important to see how Europe can address this problem of populist movement and extremist movement. What can the European do here?
Thanks. I think that here we should clarify a crucial point in the sense that extremist movements and the populist movements don't coincide perfectly. So, I mean, they are two potentially autonomous phenomena. But with reference to the focus of your question, surely the European Union can do a lot. We have, for instance, a regulation on European parties, which is very interesting. This regulation was passed in 2014 and then amended in 2018, and it is about the statutes and the funding of European political parties and European political foundations. In theory, thanks to this regulation, it is possible to check the compatibility between the values of the European political parties and political foundations with the values of the European Union. So they respect, I mean, democracy, the rule of law, the protection of fundamental rights. And thanks to this regulation, this possibility of checking the compatibilities of the values of the European parties with the values of the European Union has been importantly, I would say, reinforced. Indeed, the manner, it is called, it is a sort of authority. It is called the European Independent Authority for Political Parties and Foundation. This authority was created in order to reinforce, I mean, this check over political parties when they register, and also in order to monitor and possibly sanction, I mean, some forms of departure from the fundamental values of the EU. So, and another thing then that the EU can do is to protect our personal data, for instance, or to protect or or to fight, disinformation. In this sense, the Commission is trying to fight the spread of online disinformation and misinformation in order to guarantee the protection of the European values. In 2018, we got the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which was the first worldwide that industry has disagreed on a voluntary basis to self-regulatory standards to fight disinformation. In 2022, we got the strengthened Code of Practice on Disinformation. Recently, we got the Digital Services Act, which in a way, can be helpful in ensuring transparency. So the EU can do a lot indeed. Thank you.
Yes, and maybe it should go further, because one of the main sources of disinformation is that we have so many fake accounts which are being used by these troll factories in order to promote disinformation. And there a solution must be found, because otherwise we all can have more than 500 fake accounts to generate whatever kind of comments we want on the internet. And also the European Union is working a lot on combating the hate speech, because certain times populist and extremist movements are using hate speech in order to populate, in order to promote certain ideas. But to be fair on the populists, or regarding populism, because I know that the interview will be watched by them also, and of course they will say, oh, what you have with populism, we are right, you are wrong, and things like that. But I want to ask you a question. Is populism necessary bad for the society? Do we need populism in certain measures or not? What do you think?
Thank you. This is a very crucial question. Indeed, there are different views and definitions, of course, of populism. That's why I always use the plural populisms in order to give justice to this variety. I think that populism and democracy are not necessarily antithetical concepts. Indeed, there's as Canavan, an eminent political scientist, once said, populism is the shadow of democracy. You always have, a certain dose of populism. But populism sometimes, can also work, to favor democratic disfiguration. And this is one of the risks, of course. In everyday language, populism is normally used as a pejorative term, but I think that there are also scholars that have tried to rehabilitate the concept, like Lau move. Well, my take on that is that actually we should go beyond a mere, I would say, defensive approach. I think that we should distinguish between the populist claims and the populism as such. So in other words, populist claims could be pushed forward by either populist or non-populist forces, and non-populist forces could be obliged to push forward the populist claims, sometimes in order to compete with the populist forces, in order not to lose their voters. So I think that there are, or at least there might be some populist claims that can be filtered. That's why the title of my book, that can be filtered and channeled and made compatible with the constitutional untouchable core. And this is one of the challenges that constitutional lawyers have. And I give you some examples. So in my view, techno-populists have a point when they insist on the potential of the internet for the democracy of tomorrow. New technologies offer important, interesting ideas to redefine the relationship between direct democracy and representative democracy. in Italy during the pandemic, for instance, our parliament was really marginal because its members cannot vote remotely. And this makes no sense with today's technology. So it is true that new technology can reinforce our democracy. So the internet, it is a political resource, but make no mistake, safeguards are necessary. So the populist option of overriding parliaments is not compatible with democracy because it would produce a very dangerous form of instantaneous democracy in which there will be no space for the deliberation. And I think that the role of political parties and the role of parliament is crucial. So we can do something, I mean, to filter some of the populist claims, provided that we guarantee the pillars of our democracy. And democracy, as said, is much more than the rule of majority. There was a great lawyer, Hans Kelsen, who once said that it is true that in democracy, the majority has the right to govern. But in order to have a majority, we must preserve minorities. And this is the essence of democracy. And that's why constitutionalism can give an added value to democracy. So this is my take on that. So I think that participation is important. It is important to transform, I mean, this distrust into an active democratic virtue, but we must at the same time preserve the deliberation and the role of politics. I mean, politics is not a bad thing. I mean, politics is good. The political compromise is always necessary, I mean, to build a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would move to one last question, because I know you are specialized on this and constitutional law and how we can fight populism. Which are the legal limitations in combating radicalization?
Well, thanks indeed. Again, I mean, the answer depends on the legal context we take into account, as said. I mean, and also on what we mean by radicalization. And I mean, there are two major, I would say, models in comparative law. I mean, one is the American model, which is represented, if you want, by the words of at that time President Thomas Jefferson, who said that if there be any among us who wish to dissolve this union or to change the Republican form, let them stand undisturbed. So the idea is that free speech, I mean, should prevail always. But then we have another model which is very important in Europe, and which is the model of militant democracy. So I mean, the German model, according to which it is possible to ban some political parties if they are radical, if they are against the constitutional system. But both models have changed a lot. I mean, today I don't believe that the model of militant democracy can be used for these things, particularly when looking at populist movements. I think that this would be a sort of boomerang. This would exacerbate, I mean, to a certain extent, radicalization. So, I mean, that's why we need to work on other hypotheses. And again, I mean, I think that the European Union is doing a lot. Think of the 2020 counterterrorism agenda, which included some important initiatives in order to tackle online radicalization, or in order to face counter-terrorist also propaganda, in order to create more inclusive, I would say, a context. But radicalization is also one of the challenges that we must face when dealing with digital populism. So together with polarization, of course, and together with other phenomena. And in this sense as well, you can do something. We, for instance, got an important framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia, especially to address hate speech, which is one of the main things produced by digital populism, more at least, by the abuse of social media platforms. Because again, make no mistake, I don't think that disinformation originated, due to the social media platforms. I think that social media platforms can give more visibility to the disinformation, but
it's a catalyst.
The phenomenon, it's a catalyst. You're right, but the phenomenon existed already earlier. The thing is that the populists tend to abuse social media platforms to question the role of the gatekeepers in democratic society. So the traditional media, journalists, even scientists. You earlier mentioned the case of the pandemic. They tend to see in the populist leader not only the source of morality, but also the source of the official truth. So those who dare to question the official truth are seen as the enemy of the people. Think of the confrontation between Trump and Fauci. Think of what happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro. Think of the Novax campaign also in Italy. So we can do a lot. Again, here there are important codes of conduct promoted by the European Union on countering illegal hate speech online, plus a series of supranational initiatives, and again the Digital Services Act, which is not a remedy per se in this case, but which can again reinforce transparency, which is always helpful, to tackle this kind of radicalization.
Thank you so much for these comments, because I think it's really important to understand that when it comes to using platforms online, it's radicalization, it's done in a very targeted manner. And yes, of course, there are the traditional media, but that type of media generally has an ethic and moral conduct, and it has to check the information and in such manner that it won't spread disinformation or misinformation. But in the social media environment, you can publish whatever you want. Of course, during the pandemic, we had filters that were put in place to combat certain ideas, and I think that was very important, the first step, but much more is to be done in this respect, because disinformation is not only targeting the pandemic and the vaccines and no-vaxxer movement and so on and so forth, but we see now a very rich political agenda regarding the East, and I think it's really important to work more on that. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and thank you so much for responding so openly to our questions, which were not easy because they were quite broad, but also they were targeting certain aspects that I think that are important to understand when we talk about populism and how it works in our society. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation and for being here with us.
Thank you.
And we will see each other at the next interview, and of course we will bring you information connecting to disinformation, how disinformation works. We saw put in practice the troll factories that we were talking several interviews ago, but we will go further and we will try to at least bring you the correct information, or at least give you the means to analyze how this information works and how you are exposed to certain type of information in order to generate a reaction from you, a comment from you, a certain position from you. And in this case, you must be really, really attentive. Thank you so much for watching us, and see you again soon.